all have this picture in our minds, don't we? Jesus, the absolute symbol of goodness, of compassion. It's sort of ingrained.
The standard image.
Exactly. But what if we, really looked closely at the texts, maybe put aside that usual reverence for a moment, and asked, well, maybe an uncomfortable question.
Which is?
Could there be other sides to his character? Aspects that maybe by today's standards might seem, well, troubling.
That's exactly where we're going with this deep dive today. You, the listener, actually pointed us towards a really interesting article.
Right, the one from Mente Ateísta.
That's the one, by Jorge Garapiris, a PhD. It's titled Jesús como figura perturbada, Jesus as a disturbed figure. Una análise crítica à luz dos evangelios canónicos e apócrifos. A critical analysis using canonical and apocryphal gospels.
Okay. So just to be clear, our goal here isn't really about faith or theology itself.
No, not at all.
It's more about examining the character of Jesus as depicted in these writings. We're talking the familiar ones, the canonical gospels.
Yep.
Matthew gets a lot of focus in the article, but also those less common ones, the apocryphal texts, like the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. We're exploring some of the potentially unsettling aspects the author highlights.
Precisely. So two main kinds of sources we're looking at. First, those canonical gospels, with Matthew being key for this analysis.
Got it.
And second, these apocryphal gospels, specifically diving into the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, which gives a really different view of Jesus' childhood.
And the main point Dr. Pyers is making, it's pretty stark, isn't it?
It is. He basically argues that if you analyze these texts rationally, without the lens of faith, the behaviors described might not look like moral perfection. Instead, they could actually map onto traits we associate today with, well, serious psychological conditions.
Wow. Okay, that's definitely a bold thesis. Let's dig into the source material he uses. Where do we start?
Let's start with that Infancy Gospel of Thomas. It presents some, frankly, quite disturbing stories about Jesus as a young boy. Can you remind us of some examples the article picks out?
Sure. Yeah, this gospel shows a young Jesus with amazing powers, but how he uses them, it's often pretty shocking. Forget simple childhood stuff. We see these, extreme, sometimes lethal reactions to what seem like minor kid problems. The article mentions one where a kid ruins a game Jesus is playing.
Okay.
And Jesus supposedly makes the kid just wither up, lose his youth.
Whoa.
Then there's another story. A child bumps into him accidentally, and Jesus apparently just says a word and strikes the child dead.
Just like that.
Just like that. And maybe even more unsettling are the stories about teachers who try to challenge him or teach him. He humiliates them, even causes their deaths, according to this text.
It's fascinating and disturbing to think about those actions through, say, a modern psychological framework.
How so?
Well, the author draws parallels. Think about intermittent explosive disorder, sudden impulsive aggressive outbursts, way out of proportion to whatever triggered them.
Okay, I see that.
Or maybe oppositional defiant disorder, that pattern of anger, defiance, hostility towards authority.
Right.
And the seeming lack of empathy or remorse in these stories. It could even make you think about traits we might associate today with psychopathy, though that's obviously a very strong term.
Yeah. And what really stands out is how the adults react in these tales. You'd expect correction, right?
Yeah.
Punishment.
You would.
But instead it's described more like awe, reverence even. Like these terrible acts are proof of his divine nature. It's the complete opposite of how we'd handle a child acting out like that today.
Exactly. It's a really unsettling picture painted by that particular apocryphal text.
Okay, so that's the childhood aspect from the Infancy Gospel.
Sure.
But the article moves on to the adult Jesus in the canonical Gospels, right? Particularly Matthew.
Yes, and here the focus shifts to what the author sees as a recurring, intense preoccupation with eternal punishment. Could you pull out some of the specific verses mentioned?
Sure. Matthew's gospel does have some pretty vivid and frankly scary descriptions of what happens to those who don't follow Jesus. Well, you get phrases like being thrown into the furnace of fire where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. That's Matthew 13.42. Then there's the judgment scene. Depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire. That's Matthew 25.41.
Right.
And warnings about facing the fire of hell, Gehenna, in Matthew 5.22. This theme of unending, fiery torment comes up quite a bit.
And it's this emphasis that actually led the philosopher Bertrand Russell, famously, to suggest that Jesus seemed to take some kind of, satisfaction in describing eternal punishment.
Really? Russell said that?
He did. And Dr. Pyers, the author of the article we're looking at, pushes this further. He argues that this focus on infinite physical suffering and the level of detail sometimes used, it raises big ethical questions.
Okay.
He even uses the word sadism to describe the potential pleasure implied in imagining people burning forever. Now, psychologically, sadism means deriving pleasure from others' suffering.
Wow, that's a strong claim, applying the term sadism.
It is. The idea is that someone seen as embodying love would focus so intensely on the mechanics of eternal pain. It clashes dramatically with that conventional image.
It really does. The author seems to be saying that normalizing this kind of extreme cruelty is a major moral hurdle within the tradition itself.
Exactly. That's the argument being presented.
Okay, so moving from that, the article then looks at potential signs of, what was it, narcissism and grandiosity.
Yes. Again, looking at the canonical Gospels for statements Jesus makes about himself, what are some key quotes the author points to for this argument?
Well, there are definitely moments where Jesus demands absolute loyalty, putting himself sort of at the center of everything.
And
like in Matthew 10:37, whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. That's a pretty high bar for devotion.
Absolutely.
Then in John's Gospel, chapter 6, verse 56, whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life. Very symbolic, but also very centered on him. And probably the most famous one, John 14:6. I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me.
Okay. So if we step outside the theological interpretation for a moment
Yeah.
and just look at those statements through a psychological lens, the author suggests they could be seen as indicators of what we might call grandiose delusions.
Grandiose delusion.
Yeah, an exaggerated sense of your own importance, power, or identity, demanding loyalty above family, claiming to be the only way to truth or God. These are traits sometimes associated with narcissistic personality disorder, especially when beliefs reach messianic levels.
That's quite a perspective shift, to view core theological statements as possible symptoms.
It definitely forces you to look at the text from a very different angle, which is the author's goal.
Okay, so childhood issues, focus on punishment, potential grandiosity. What else does the article explore?
It also delves into what the author sees as significant swings, oscillations between tenderness and violence or aggression.
Like contradictions in behavior?
Kind of. Contrasting the teachings of love, like loving your enemies in the Sermon on the Mount.
Right, the core message many focus on.
With other instances that seem quite aggressive. The article uses the example of Jesus cursing the fig tree. Remember that one? Mark 11.
Vaguely, because it didn't have fruit.
Exactly, even though it wasn't the season for figs. It might seem minor, but the author points to it as a sudden display of anger leading to a destructive act.
Yeah.
And beyond that single incident, there are also the numerous prophecies Jesus makes about future wars, disasters, and divine punishments for those who don't believe.
So love your enemies on one hand, but predict destruction for non-believers on the other.
That's the contrast the author is highlighting. This apparent rapid shifting between love and condemnation, tenderness and pronouncements of violence. The author suggests this could indicate a pattern of affective instability. Maybe a pattern seen in things like bipolar spectrum disorders, with their mood shifts, or even borderline personality disorder, known for intense, unstable emotions and behaviors.
So it's suggesting a kind of emotional volatility.
That seems to be the implication drawn in the analysis, yes.
Okay, so putting all these pieces together, the apocryphal childhood, the focus on eternal punishment, the claims of grandiosity, the emotional swings, what's the author's final takeaway, the big conclusion?
The core argument, really, is that if you strip away the lens of faith, as the author puts it, and analyze Jesus like any other historical figure based only on these texts, his reported behavior often seems deeply disturbing, potentially even dangerous by modern standards.
And the reason he's seen as an ethical ideal.
The article suggests it's not because of inherent consistency or moral perfection in the accounts themselves, but more because of the protective power of religious belief over centuries. Faith shields the figure from this kind of critical analysis.
And there was a final point about the followers.
Yes, a very provocative one. The author suggests the enduring myth of Jesus might actually tell us more about the fear and maybe the submission of his followers throughout history.
Than about the actual nature of a benevolent God.
Exactly. It's a very critical, very challenging reading of the situation.
Okay. So to kind of wrap up this deep dive, we've looked at this critical analysis by Jorge Guerra-Pires. It definitely challenges the traditional image of Jesus.
Absolutely. It uses both canonical and apocryphal sources to point out behaviors and motivations that seem potentially troubling when viewed outside a religious framework.
It raises some fundamental questions.
It certainly does.
So maybe here's a final thought for you, our listener, to sort of mull over.
Okay.
If these exact same stories, the impulsive violence as a child, the intense focus on eternal hellfire, the demands for total devotion, the big swings between love and aggression, if these were attributed to any other historical figure, someone not central to a major religion,
How would we view them then?
yeah, how would we perceive that person?
Yeah, Lee.
And what does our potential difference in perception tell us about the sheer power of belief, of tradition, in shaping how we see ethical models, how we interpret history?
That's a powerful question to leave things on.
Yeah.
It really invites reflection on how context shapes understanding.
Definitely something to think about. We'd encourage you to maybe look into these sources yourselves, consider different perspectives on this very complex figure,